Now that we've made our way through the policymaking and policy analysis processes, it's time to think about the different areas of policy in which these policymakers and policy analysts actually think about. In this module, we'll consider the power of the government to influence the economy, otherwise known as economic and budgetary policy. This policy area includes programs and policies designed to improve economic conditions in the United States. While the average American has little concern for economic policy, the United States government and governments in general are highly focused on economic policy. Why? Because it provides the means to engage in all other policy interventions. Everything the government decides to do or doesn't decide to do costs money. As such, a robust economic policy is important for a growing country. Thus, in seeking to improve economic conditions in the United States, policymakers have 5 key goals in mind. We will consider each of these goals now in turn. The first thing policymakers want to do is to generate greater growth in the economy. But ask yourself, what does that mean? What is the tangible goal here? And further, how do we operationalize it? What measures can we use to know if we're achieving economic growth? Well, if the economy is nothing more than a manifestation of the goods and services produced by a country, a tangible goal towards economic growth is to produce more of those goods and services each year. This goal, however, is heavily tied to how we operationalize growth. The most widely considered measure of growth is the GDP, or the gross domestic product of a country. This is if you take all the finished goods and services produced within a country within a specific period of time, be it a quarter, a month, a year, etc., and assign a monetary value to it. Essentially, it's the total worth of everything produced. Often, we will look at the change in GDP from one period of time to another. If that change is positive, we say it's a growth or an expansion of the economy. If that value is negative, then we say that the economy has shrinking. The other way we think about GDP is at the individual level. We think about this as GDP per capita, or GDP by person. We consider this the ability of individuals essentially to buy goods then in the economy. Yet this is just one way to operationalize measures of the economy or growth. What other ways do you think, aside from GDP, we could operationalize economic growth? Take a second here and think about it. All right, now that you've thought about it, what did you come up with? You might have thought of something like GNP, or gross national product. You often hear that term thrown around. Basically, it's just GDP plus money coming in from overseas, essentially investment from abroad. Maybe you thought about it in terms of consumerism, like how much we're spending. If we're spending more, perhaps the economy is doing well. Or maybe you thought about it in terms of your own pocketbook, something like the standard of living. What's the change been? Has things gotten better or gotten worse? This, however, might be a little bit tricky to quantify. Policymakers want economic growth, but why? What is the impact of a growing economy? Well, during times of plenty, when the economy is doing well, revenues increase. More people are working, they're paying their income taxes. Corporations and businesses are producing products and selling them and paying their taxes as well too, so therefore there's more money into the coffers. With this expanded revenue, the government can invest in other programs that increase quality of life for its people. Further, during times of plenty, expenses go down. More people are working, and thus there's less need or demand for support programs like welfare and food stamps. We call these programs counter-cyclical programs because they run counter to business cycles in the government. Basically, as the economy goes up, demand for these goes down. They run counter to each other. But what's the opposite? During poor times like recessions, the economy goes south, and thus there's greater demand for these programs as people aren't in work and incomes are shrinking. So what can policymakers do when the economy is cooling off or in a recession? Actually, policymakers are rather limited in what they can do. And very often, the policy tool that is chosen by the policymakers is determined by their partisanship and ideology. As such, when the economy is cooling off, policymakers can really do 2 things. They can either cut taxes or they can increase government spending. So how do each of these work? Well, during a recession, many people lose their jobs, some lose hours, and ultimately incomes shrink. People become more cautious about spending and tend to hold on to their money. Thus, what can the government do? It can cut taxes on these individuals. If you reduce the amount of money that individuals have to spend back to the government, then that leaves more money in their pocket to spend and hopefully will stimulate the economy. The other option is for policymakers to increase government spending. During poor economic times, the government will make investments in things like infrastructure, the environment, energy. They'll create new government programs to put people back to work. Essentially, the idea is a return on investment. For every dollar the government spends, hopefully they get more back. During the recent economic recession, policymakers actually chose to do both of these policy tools. This is when you heard about the economic stimulus plan, where the government spent $787 billion in investments. This policy was a combination of things like tax breaks and credits for individuals, i.e. the tax cuts, as well as increased government spending on things like unemployment, infrastructure, and safety. A central piece of the economic stimulus was a focus on infrastructure investments, basically to fix the crumbling infrastructure in the country. We often consider infrastructure improvement during economic downturns, but why is that the case? This is actually a Depression-era tactic. FDR created the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the Great Depression. It employed out-of-work men, gave them food, housing, and a paycheck. In turn, they were put to work building the infrastructure of the country. In particular, they focused on a lot of the nation's parks. If you've ever gone camping or gone to a national park and seen some of the cabins that are there, many of those cabins were built during the Great Depression by the CCC.